Welcome back. So let's talk about what happens to Greece after it passes this transitional phase into classicism and embraces full classicism. First, we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson. So immediately after the Persian Wars, Greece experiences something that it hadn't experienced before. It's a roughly unified group of people that are in an alliance that we call the Delian League. But as time goes on, the Delian League comes to be dominated by one entity, and that is Athens. And Athens makes a deal to everyone else. It says, look, you may not have ships or navies or warriors, but we do. But you may have food or money or something else. So instead, you send the tribute to us, and we'll take over the defense of the region, because we're really good at that, and this will cease to be the Delian League and become let's call it the Athenian Empire. Now, that was a good deal for some of these city-states that really didn't want to provide for their own defense because they were just too small to do otherwise, but it meant that they were now subject to the Athenians. And there was one group of people who just weren't going to have any of that, and you can guess that, and that was Sparta. And so Sparta decides there's no way it's going to transition from the Delian League into being part of the Athenian Empire. It says no way. So what we end up is a whole bunch of states that are allied for common defense, and Athens more or less assimilating them under its umbrella. And this starts off the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans, who were, not going to give in to the Persians, were certainly not going to give in to Athens, even after they had helped them conquer the Persians. And we have a record of this entire war by Thucydides. It's a marvelous history, because it's one of the first histories in the history of history. Oh, that was redundant. It's one of the first histories that treats history as the product of individual choice and chance. Previous histories always invoked the gods or, the fates, but this just pretty much portrays the Athenians and the Spartans as motivated by their own interests. What's interesting is he even portrays the Athenians as venal and as kind of immoral at times, and the Spartans as inflexible. There's really no good guys in this war. Give a case in point, there's a tiny little island out here in the Cyclades called Milos. And Milos had kinship with Sparta, but it wanted to stay out of this fight. And Athens said, hell no, you either join up with us or we'll conquer you. Milos was an island, it had strategic importance, and it didn't have the means to defend itself against a big nation like Athens. So Thucydides records what was called the Melian Dialogues. The Melians basically make the case. It says, hey, we're neutral. How is it right and just that Athens has the power to come in here and tell us to capitulate or die? And Athens pretty much says, as quoted by Thucydides, right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It's really kind of despicable that here you have the Athenians who, were founded on this idea of democracy and equality, at least amongst citizens, and yet they didn't extend that to any of these other city-states. So you can understand why Sparta was pissed, and unfortunately the Melians did resist, and they were destroyed. So it wasn't a kind of a nice war, and everything that could go wrong went wrong in this war. One of my favorite stories is the mutilation of the Herms. Herbs were statues like this that had square bases, but had heads that were the heads of gods, usually Hermes, the messenger of the gods. But they were signposts and put up at crossroads and were kind of protective deities. And Alcibiades was on his way to go to Sicily as part of this war against Sparta, and the night before, somebody went around the town and mutilated all the Herms. They knocked them down, smashed their heads open, which is a huge insult. And so Alcibiades got, nailed for this, and he says, screw this, I'm leaving anyway, and he left, and he eventually turned tail and went over to the other side, went over to the Spartan side. So the whole thing was a colossal mess, and it's the end of the Peloponnesian War that marks the end of this golden age. So just to give you a sense, we have the Persian Wars, with the Battle of Marathon being the big turning point, the Athenian Empire, the Peloponnesian Wars. And it is during this time period that we get the High Classical period. That the severe period is from about the end of the Battle of Marathon up until about the middle of the 5th century, 460, 450 or so. And this High Classical period is just this narrow tail end. So the Classical period from start to finish is just 100 years long. That's it. That's the entire high point of Athens. After this point, Athens will cease to be a major power. It's really kind of remarkable. We hold Athens up in our esteem as this birthplace of Western civilization, but its empire and its power only really lasted for about 100 years. After that, the power moves on to Philip II of Macedon, who comes down from the north, conquers Greece, conquers Athens, and Athens turns into something like a university town, a place where people to go get educated, but not the center of an empire. The centers of the empire will move north to places like Aigai, Pella, and over to Alexandria and Egypt and elsewhere. And so this High Classical period is a very, very short period of time, but much like Egypt, it has a very long shadow. And we enter into kind of a late classical period and eventually into what we call the Hellenistic period, where the son of Philip II goes out and conquers the whole known world, but after he conquers it, he too loses his empire very quickly. Right after his death, it all falls apart. He leaves no heirs, and it breaks up amongst his various generals into Macedonia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Seleucid Syria. And this is the marking point between what we call the Hellenic period, that is the period of Greek culture spread by Greeks, and the Hellenistic period, the period of Greek culture spread by non-Greeks, by people who see Greek culture and say, wow, that's cool, I want to get in on that, rather than Greeks who are spreading it themselves. So it's a remarkably short period of time, this classical window that we're talking about. And always, there's this character back here, Rome. Rome is growing in power, and eventually Rome comes to dominate the entire Mediterranean, and it is the inheritor, ultimately, of all of the innovations of the classical period, and eventually ends up conquering all of what was Syria, all of what was Egypt, all of what was Macedonian Greece, including Sparta, all of what is Italy or Magna Graecia, and the entire Mediterranean. It's really remarkable. So let's get into this, and let's talk about the region of Athens. This is the Attican Peninsula, and this is Athens today. As you can see in a satellite, Athens is a gigantic, sprawling, modern metropolis that covers this entire section. Greece has a very, very small population compared to other European nations, even today. But, and almost all of it is within the suburbs of Athens. It's kind of crazy, but it wasn't nearly this big at its high point, yet it was a great cultural gem, noted for its accomplishments and its achievements, a really genuinely beautiful city. This is why long after it ceased to be the capital of an empire, it was still, as I said, a kind of university town, a place where people would go to have their children taught, to learn culture. It became a reservoir of culture. It became what we call a legacy city. A legacy city is a city that isn't the head of an empire. It isn't a major financial capital. It's a place that there was so much culture that it just continues to persist. The ideal legacy city today is Venice. Venice was once the center of trade for the entire Adriatic, and was a major banking and trading area, but today it's predominantly a tourist trap, and a place that people go to see culture. But all of that money brought all that culture there and continued to bring people there for centuries. It's the same thing for Athens. Athens continued to live on the legacy of this high point of the 5th century. And a lot of the credit goes to this guy, Pericles. So Pericles becomes the ruler of the Athenian democracy. His formal title is strategos, which just means general. Again, there was a mechanism in Athenian democracy for somebody assuming total control of the treasury and the military and political powers. If you remember in our last lecture, I talked about how fractious and divisive Athenian democracy was, that it often would have riots and political parties. The boule would come together, and there were hardly any elected offices that lasted longer than a year. Some only lasted 10 days or a day. And if you have to get everybody together to vote on every issue, it's just chaos. And so to simplify that, in times of need, they would invest all power of the state into one individual, and that's Pericles. Now, the problem with this is this creates dictators and tyrants, but, sometimes you need to move quickly, and that was the nature of it. So Pericles takes all of this power, and remember, he's there at the time of the Athenian Empire, so they're getting all of this tribute from all of these other city-states all over Greece. And he uses this tribute to rebuild the Acropolis and the Parthenon. And so this is the person responsible for a massive building program that rebuilds all of Athens. And it's his fingerprints that are on the remnants of Athens as we see it today. He ultimately dies in the Peloponnesian Wars. He goes off to fight in the Peloponnesian Wars, but not before he leaves this lasting legacy of rebuilding the center of Athens. So Athens is built around the Acropolis. An Acropolis literally means it's the high place or the high city. It's a natural rocky outcropping that sticks up above the rest of the town. Around the base of the Acropolis is where the old city used to be, and you can see how even today it sticks up above the city. So the old city, the Plaka, is this region here to one side, and that's where the medieval city is today. But the modern city has grown up in all directions. It's now a massive city. So if you remember in the ancient Near East and elsewhere that they believed that the higher place was somehow closer to the god. That makes sense. And so they built these ziggurats so that they could have the god closer to the heavenly plane. Well, you don't need to do that in Greece because you have lots of nice rocky promontories. And so that's what this was used for. And it also was a Mycenaean citadel. There was a Mycenaean citadel up there that was destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. And if you go up there, you can still find some remnants of a Mycenaean wall. They're still up there. There's an amazing level of occupations. There's so many cultures that have been there over the centuries. So let's talk about what the Acropolis was like just before Pericles comes along. So the Acropolis was the home to some very, very old temples. There was the Archaic temple of Athena, Polias, which is Athena, protector of the city. And this temple was destroyed in 490 in the first Persian invasion. And so after the Battle of Marathon, there was a decision that, okay, we need to rebuild a temple. So they built a new temple, and this temple is called the Old Parthenon, and it was begun in 488, but it was never completed because the war raged on, and in 480, the Persians came in and burned it down, and burned all of Athens down. Athens was almost utterly, completely destroyed by the Persians. So therefore, it had to be rebuilt. Let's take a look at the Archaic temple first. So the Archaic temple is a very old temple. It was an Archaic period temple, and was kind of a strange temple, as near as we can tell from the floor plan. It had lots of different chambers. Again, it still had a symmetrical, pronaos with an opisthodemus on the top, but it also had aditons, these wonderful little kind of secondary chambers, which were used for, we're not entirely certain what. The remnants and the foundations of the old temple are still there, so if you go to the Erechtheion, and just to one side of the Erechtheion are the old foundations of the Archaic temple, and some of the Archaic sculpture still survives. Here's a scene of Athena. She is wearing the aegis. The aegis is the snake-edged breastplate or mantle that goes over her shoulders, that has the Medusa head, the Gorgonian on the breast. And here she is, tackling and fighting a giant. So there are some, evidence that there was a massive sculptural program there. So that temple was destroyed by the Persians. So they decided, well, let's build a bigger, newer temple. And they build it over the top of an even earlier temple that we don't know much about. It was a temple simply known as the Hekatomperon, which means it's a 100-foot temple, although it actually was longer than 100 feet. So it was basically, it means the big temple, is what they were talking about. So they tore down that temple to build the older Parthenon, but the older Parthenon was never completed. Shortly after they had begun work on it, you have the second invasion of the Persians. The Persians come in, burn down most of Athens, and knock it down. And so the only remnants we have of this massive temple are some drums and some blocks that were used to shore up a retaining wall. So in the rush to rebuild and to defend Athens, they just took the building materials and rebuilt it. Rebuilt some of the walls with some of the rubble left over from this temple. So Pericles said that just won't do. Now it remained kind of unfinished, burned down, half abandoned for 33 years. I'm not really certain why. Part of it was Athens had really suffered from the war, and so they just didn't have the money. They just didn't have the means to rebuild it. The second thing is that there was apparently an oath made, that they made an oath that they would not rebuild any of the buildings until they had utterly defeated the Persians. And somehow that oath, the terms of that oath were never quite fulfilled. But Pericles decided it was time. That after 30 years, it was time to remove this eyesore and give the goddess of the city a proper temple. And this becomes what we call the Parthenon, and it is the masterpiece of Greek architecture today. So let's take a look at the Acropolis. The Acropolis, as we see it today in its ruined state, is with some modifications. I mean, there were lots of buildings that were added later by Hellenistic kings and by Romans, so it's not entirely 5th century, but most of the character of what we know there was, done in the 5th century. And so we're going to take a look at the various parts of it and this amazing structure, starting with the Propylaea, which is the main entrance from the west end. So, taking a look at it, just so to orient you to it, so this is what this would have been like around the mid-5th century BC, around the time that Pericles rebuilt it. So this is the temple to Athena Parthenos, that is Athena the Virgin, that's what Parthenos means. So Parthenon means the temple of the Virgin. So that's why we call it the Parthenon. And this was what was built under Pericles' program. Then there's another building that's built right to the side of where the old archaic temple of Athena Polias existed, where that existed, and that's the Erechtheion. And the Erechtheion is dedicated to Erechtheus. Erechtheus was one of the legendary founder kings of Athens. And so this is a memorial to some of the early cults, some of the early shrines associated with him in the early days of Athens. And the next major monument is the Propylaea. And the Propylaea just means big gate. That's all it is. It's just the gate that comes in front. That's the entryway up to the Acropolis. On the Propylaea is a later temple called the Temple of Athena Nike, or Athena the Victor. And so you see her there. It's a tiny little temple, but we'll take a look at it too. Just to orient you from this recreation, here's the Parthenon. Here is the Erechtheion. This is the Propylaea, and this right here is the Temple of Athena Nike. So let's start with the Propylaea. As you come up the west side, the Propylaea is a massive staircase and a gateway that leads you up to the Acropolis. Everyone who came to the Acropolis would have to come up through this entrance. The purpose of this entrance, of course, is to be a monumental gateway. It gets access to a lot of people. It can accommodate a lot of people coming up to the top, but it also is there just to be an imposing presence. So everybody knows they're coming into an impressive building. And so it is a gateway built over the top of a massive staircase, and it has multiple levels. As you come into it, it has a very large facade, but it also has two side buildings. And the side buildings would house libraries, but they would also house rooms with trophies. And a trophy is any item that you brought back from any of these countries that you conquered. So if they conquered another Greek city-state and they had some memorial sculpture that was considered very beautiful, or objects that were culturally significant, they would drag them back and stick them here. And so that's a kind of important point. This was a way of showing the magnificence of Athens. So you came into it, you would see kind of mementos of all the places, souvenirs of all the places that they had conquered. Here is the Temple of Athena Nike. We'll come back and talk about that later. The Temple of Athena Nike recently underwent a massive restoration project. When I first went there, it was really in a bad state many years ago, and the last time I went there, it was gone. They had completely removed it brick by brick, and so that would have been 2010. It wasn't there in 2010, but it's back now. They have put it back brick for brick and replaced a lot of the missing chunks of it. But we'll talk about that in a bit. So as we get up to it, the Propylaea is missing a lot of the upper section. But it is an example of the Doric order, a really excellent example of the Doric order. Should recognize the Doric order. We have triglyphs. Now the triglyphs here and metopes, the metopes were never decorated. Again, they'll save that kind of stuff for the fancier buildings. But here are the abacus and the echinus of the columns. Notice the columns have no base. But we have a really beautiful example of this high-style Doric order. Again, the Doric order is seen as masculine, strong, powerful, with lots of virility as the idea. And so it gives a very strong, imposing entrance. They've recently restored some of the original lintels, and this whole thing was covered in stone lintels and a coffered ceiling, and so you can see the lighter colored marble. They actually went to the original quarries and got some of the original marble from the original quarries to replace some of these sections. So the darker marble is the older marble, and the lighter marble is the newer marble. As you come up into this hallway, it turns into a forest of columns, very similar to a hypostyle. Here you can see again the lighter marble versus the darker marble. And as you get to these columns are actually Ionic columns. So they change orders right through the center of the building. But we'll talk more about the Ionic order when we get to the Erechtheion. So as you cross the back side of it, part of the pediment and the facade for the back side of the Propylaea is still there. So this is the back side of the Propylaea looking towards the west. So if you turn around, you'd be seeing the Parthenon. As you look at these, you can tell these are made up of drums. They're made out of large drums and columns. We already talked a little bit about building techniques. When you make columns this size, you can make them monolithically, that is a single block, but that's actually very difficult. So instead, they would make them out of drums, and then the drums would have pins that would fit them together. All Greek masonry was technically dry masonry. What we mean by dry masonry is that there's no mortar used. When you think of, masonry, you think mortar. But there was no mortar. This is all masonry that's fit together. And so the way you got the blocks to fit together was just gravity, just the sheer mass and weight of these massive blocks, or you would hold them together by various pins. Here are collections of different kinds of pins that were made out of bronze that were used to hold the blocks together. Unfortunately, bronze being a very valuable material, when the building fell out of use, people knocked the building over so they could pry and salvage the bronze out of the building. In the 19th century, when they put the blocks back together, they used iron pins, which was a terrible decision because iron expands when it gets wet, it rusts, and it not only stained the beautiful Parian marble, but it also expanded enough that it split and damaged some of these blocks. So a lot of the damage that's been done to the Parthenon has actually been relatively recently, last 200 years. It's really a shame. You would put these blocks into position with cranes. The Greeks had lots of different crane technologies, pulleys, block and tackles, and a whole variety of turnstiles or winches. And you would lift them into place, holding them in with steel, clamps and cramps. They would leave sometimes little nodes or edges on these things to lift the blocks into place, and then you could just carve those off once the blocks were placed. Or sometimes they would use a key. here's a kind of tackle that would fit into a slot, and you would wedge it in. Sometimes they would cut U-shaped things in the ends of the blocks, and they didn't care about these because once the blocks were all matched together, you'd never see it. So there's lots of different ways these things were put together. One of the major points of the Propylaea was supposed to frame your advent, your coming up to the Acropolis itself. So as you looked through the final gate of the Propylaea, there from the other side, you would see the Parthenon. And it was deliberately designed to frame this space. So as you come up through the gate, you don't see anything, and then suddenly the Parthenon would be there, and it would be an absolute revelation. So the Parthenon itself, as you come up the road onto the Acropolis, you would have seen it from the west end. Now, the west end is not the main end. That is the backside of the temple, but these things look identical side to side. So you would actually come up and you would see it from this corner. So you would actually see it from the northwest corner, and you would see two sides at a time. So here's the west end and here's the east end. And that means you would have to actually walk around to the other side to get the east side. And that's actually intentional. They wanted you to see this thing from two angles simultaneously. They didn't want you to just line up with the facade. They wanted you to get a sense of the scale of the whole building all at once. They wanted it to just be overwhelming in its scale. Here's a building, it's, over 60 feet high, and it must have just been staggering. Greeks really did treat their buildings almost like they were freestanding sculptures. As you get to the west facade, you can see just the scale of how big this thing is. Here's another one. It's currently undergoing a restoration, and you can see the scale of the people. Now notice that you have these three steps here. So the bottom two steps are the stereobate, and the top step is the stylobate. But gosh, I hope you've been doing your CrossFit, because getting up those steps is going to be really hard. Look at how small the people are relative to that. And so this is something that's really interesting about Greek art, is that, remember, when these were originally designed, they were designed on a much smaller scale for wooden architecture. So what they did is they just simply scaled it up. They just took everything and just scaled up the proportions. So the steps are no longer steps. They're kind of formalist details. It's kind of funny. And so they actually have to put other steps in there so you can get up to the porch. You would then have to walk around the long side of the building to the east facade, and this was the main entrance in the time of the Greeks. And it's really just incredibly beautiful. Here you can see that, they've put in a couple of extra steps in there. There's still really tall steps, even though those are tall steps. Those are big risers, man. So the scale of it, here you can see, this person here standing way back is really gobsmacking. Now, the Parthenon has had a very, very rough life, and it's very unfortunate that most of the interior of the Parthenon is collapsed. As you can see, it is surrounded by huge fields of blocks of stone from this and other buildings. It's a massive jigsaw puzzle with no picture on how to put it back together. And so currently the restoration project is sorting all this block to try to put it back in order. The interior naos walls, of course, the roof is gone. Most of the pediments, most of the sculpture, and large chunks of the columns are gone. Here you can see that looking towards the east end, this is inside looking towards the east, only a little bit of the actual naos is still there. As you look around to the west end, there's a little bit more of the west end, but most of that is gone. Now, the sad thing about all of this is that most of this had actually survived up until the 17th century. So the church was the temple was converted to a Christian church in the 6th century. They took off the main roof and they added an apse. They got rid of the interior sculpture, but they left everything else intact. And it actually was a Christian church for longer than it was a pagan temple. It was only a pagan temple for about 800, 900 years, and it was a Christian church. It was the cathedral of the city, dedicated to the Virgin Mary for longer than that. When the Ottomans conquered, they came over and they turned it into a mosque. But it didn't last long as a mosque because a couple hundred years later, during a siege of the city, the Muslims, the Ottomans, used it as a warehouse, as a gunpowder magazine, as an ammo dump. And unfortunately, a Venetian mortar, which was sieging the city, lobbed into the building, hit the powder stores, and blew it up. And this is where most of the damage to the building actually took place. And it blew out the walls of the columns, the interior, and it was really in a desperate state. The Ottomans built a tiny little mosque in the empty space in between in 1715. Now, when Greece eventually regained its independence, this became a very important site because this was the birth of Greek civilization, and so they saw this as a very important part of their heritage. So did a lot of other Europeans at the time, and so they made the effort to try to put back up as much of it as they could in the 19th century, in the 1860s, as they started excavating the site. But unfortunately, that was very early in the history of archaeology, and they got a lot of it wrong. The 19th century restoration, or partial restoration, really did almost as much damage as anything did before. So now they are currently in the process of a second restoration, and you can see that they have taken down a bunch of the columns. Many of the columns in the 19th century restoration, they had a drum from one column over here and a drum from a column over here that really should have been together, and they just, put them together the best they could. It's really kind of ad hoc. But you can see now that they are replacing it with this original marble. And this is what the original marble would have looked like. This is from the same quarry that the original marble was quarried from. And you can see that they've sorted all of the pieces, and they're actually rebuilding the wall. The goal is to rebuild the entire thing, to totally restore it. Of course, this is going to cost millions upon millions. And unfortunately, Greece is in dire financial straits, and it was going pretty well until the financial crisis hit, and then the worldwide financial crisis hit, and then England left the EU, and lots of things have happened. So they're still planning on going with it, but it has slowed, unfortunately, dramatically. It would have looked something like this in its prime, and yes, those colors are probably close to the original. Remember, all ancient statuary was painted. So it would have been very bright and lively. This just absolute gleaming marble. And it would have been surrounded with all kinds of sculpture and artifacts. Remember, Athena, anytime you are saved from a plague or you are saved from battle, you would erect a statue, a memorial to Athena on the Acropolis. And so it would have been very crowded by contemporary aesthetics, but also very lively. There has been one full-scale reproduction built for a World's Fair in Nashville, Tennessee. It was constructed out of concrete, so the material is not quite right and the right color, but it does give you an accurate sense of the scale of the thing. So as far as the plan of the Parthenon goes, it's just like our previous Greek temples, except larger. It has a naos, it has a pronaos, it has the opisthydamus, but it does have an adyton. In this case, the adyton is not added to the naos and doesn't have any access to the naos, so it really actually acts more as a larger opisthydamus. And again, the purpose for this was it served as a treasury, a place where you could go and give things. That if you survived a battle in war, you would take the helmet that the arrow had stuck into, and the helmet that saved your life. You would write your name on it and dedicate this to the victory to Athena, and you would place it there. But there were also fabulous golden treasures and objects that were just given as devotions to the goddess. So these were real treasuries and treasure houses. On the interior, it would have had an upper gallery, and it too was also Doric. The roof would have been made out of wood. And down at the far end was the very famous Elephantine statue of Athena Parthenos. So we've already talked about Elephantine statues. But just to refresh your memory, a Elephantine statue is a statue made out of ivory and gold. So the ivory would have been taken from elephant ivory, and the pieces would have been fitted together so tightly that the legend says that they couldn't even find the seams in them. The rest of the statue would have been made either on a wooden or a bronze framework that then would have been covered in hammered sheets of gold. So if you know the Statue of Liberty is actually made on a steel framework, and the skin of it is made out of hammered sheets of copper. So this would have been similar, but then with gold. The ivory, to keep it from cracking, the legend is that they would pour 40 amphora, 40 huge vases of olive oil over it every day to oil the ivory, to keep the ivory from cracking. And here you can see this individual, the scale of this thing. This is the reproduction from the Parthenon in Nashville, but it does give you a sense of what it looks like. And you may say, well, it's not there today. How do we know what it looks like? Well, because people had souvenirs of them. This is the Varvikeon. Varvikeon is a statue that's based on this, on Athena, on the statue of Athena Parthenos. And so people would go to the Parthenon, and you would get a little statue. You know, you go to New York, you get a little statue of Liberty. If you go to Florence, you get a little statue of David. There's souvenir garbage, and this has been going on for, oh gosh, thousands of years. So, you know, people wanted copies of it, so there were copies made. So we can reasonably reconstruct it. As far as iconography goes, she wears the aegis. The aegis is the snake-edged breastplate or mantle that she wears. On it, it has the face of the Gorgon. She wears a Chalcedonian helm. Chalcedonian helm has the earpieces up, and it had horses and a crest on the top of it. On one side was a shield, and behind the shield was the Pythoi, the serpent, the python. And then you had her extending her hand, and on her hand, alighted on her hand, was a winged figure, and this is the winged figure of Nike, so the goddess of victory, awarding victory. Athena, of course, was the goddess of wisdom, everybody knows that, but she was also the goddess of craft, technology, and war. One of the more famous statues of Athena was called Athena Promachus, Athena first in war, which is kind of interesting. We don't think of Athena as the goddess of war, but she was. She was the goddess of war. I know everybody thinks Ares is the god of war. He is, but he's a god of, like, vengeance and bloodshed. Different kind of war. There's more than one kind of war. So around the outside of the building, we have, again, because this is the Doric order, a series of metopes and triglyphs all the way around the outside. These have suffered very badly over the years, partially because they were destroyed by Christians who saw them as pagan and heathenists, and partially because later collectors, Lord Elgin being the most important, would come along and knock them out so that they could take them back. So they're very damaged, but you can tell there's their triglyphs and there's your metopes, so definitely Doric order. Most of the metopes have not survived intact. This is on the east end. The themes seem to be themes of war and of cultural kind of domination. There seem to be scenes that come from the Gigantomachy, which is the battle of the gods and the giants, the battles of the Greeks against the Amazons, and the battles of the Lapiths against the Centaurs. We'll talk a little about those coming on. One of the things that's so amazing about this is if you look at the facade, you'll notice that at the main entrance, the triglyphs are directly over the columns. But as you get outside, the triglyph is just a little bit to the one side of the center line of the column. Now, they knew that, the problem is that if you space the triglyphs and the metopes evenly, and the triglyphs are always directly over the column, by the time you got to the end, you'd have a tiny little kind of metope that would turn the corner, and that would be an awkward metope. And nobody wants awkward metopes, They would just, sit against the wall, and, wishing that they could, ask the cool metopes to dance, But when the cool metopes ever come over, they would just freeze. Get it? Freeze? Because it's a free... Okay. Last dad joke for the evening, I swear. Okay. So the architects in this case, Iktinos and Kallikrates, were very clever, and they put in a lot of subtle optical adjustments. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So what they decided to do is they stretched the metapiece. So you can see the measurements of the metapiece, that they get longer and longer and longer until the metape on the end is so long that it actually puts the triglyph out to the end. And so there you have it. No awkward metapes on the corners that have to turn the corners. As far as the subject matter of the metapes, again, are going to be, again, Amazons versus Greeks, Lapiths versus Centaurs. It's going to be about the triumph of civilization. What I mean by that is that the Greeks see themselves, particularly the Athenians, see themselves as the triumph over the forces of barbarism and savagery. So if you remember the story of the Lapiths and the Centaurs, the Centaurs start to get frisky with the Lapith women, and so the Lapith men kill all the Centaurs. And so the Centaurs are half beast, half man, so they're a symbol of barbarism. And same thing with the other stories and the other themes, that this was something that exemplifies the military dominance of Athens, but also that Athens is this force bringing civilization and culture to the world by stamping out all the barbaric things. As objects, they're really marvelous, though. Look at this beautiful line in the composition. Gone are the stiff poses. These things are really remarkably dynamic. I love how this figure here has this poor centaur by the hair and is pulling him back. And you have these strong diagonal compositions, but you still have this beautiful sweeping drapery behind. The interplay of these two characters as the legs interlock, and as the centaur comes up with his hand on his throat, but he returns with a fist to his face. And then just the details, the horse anatomy, the veins, the muscles, all of the details are really quite exquisite. Now, one of the other optical adjustments that the architects, Iktinos and Kallikrates, did was the spacing of the columns. Now, as you look at this, you probably don't think, wow, those columns are all spaced differently. It probably looks pretty even to you, but the truth is they are all spaced differently. The space between the two center columns is the widest, and they get narrower and narrower until you get to the two outer columns. So you can see this distance is much wider than this distance, and I've even worked out this fabulous animation so you can see how pronounced the distance is. And so this exists for a number of reasons. There's a kind of forced perspective to this building. They want to focus your attention on the center path, and they have everything else kind of move away. They make these adjustments so that the architectural sculpture fits in neatly. There's also another kind of adjustment. If you look at this building, it looks remarkably straight, but as you can see in the measurements, the distances are all different. Every single distance is different. That's really remarkable. They made all of these adjustments. In fact, as you look at this building, it looks utterly straight, but it's not. Every single line in the building is curved. And this is a product of what we call Entasis. Entasis is where you curve the features of the building in order to make the building look straight. Now, you think you've seen a straight line in your life, and I hate to break it to you, you've never seen a straight line in your life. Your eye is round, your lens is round, your retina is round and curved. Every line you've ever seen is curved. And all those curved lines come into your brain, and your brain goes, oh crap, and it has to Photoshop them. It has to, it has to torque them into shape to make them appear the way they really are, that they're straight. And so you think what you're seeing is straight, but what you're really seeing is your brain straightening out something that it knows to be straight, but the information that's come in has come in curved. It's really remarkable. This is why so many optical illusions work. And people in the ancient world were aware of this. They recognized that if you have a very, very big straight line, it actually appears dished if it's over a long distance. So if you want something to appear straight, you actually have to curve it in the opposite direction. You have to curve it against the intent of your eye and the intent of your brain trying to straighten it out. And you can see this in subtle things. you can actually lay your head down on the stereobate, and you can see that it's ever so slightly curves up in the middle and then falls off towards the end. You can really see it on this stair. So there is not a single straight line in the entire building, but it's a series of incredibly subtle curves. Now, this has enormous impact on the restoration, because when they did the restoration in the 19th century, they just put the blocks however they could best fit them together. But each block is carved to fit one location and one location in that building only. And because they're all curved to fit this same curve. And so that means that part of the restoration is putting those blocks back in the right order. And boy, is that a jigsaw puzzle of all jigsaw puzzles. But they're doing it, and the results, everybody has said, you can already tell a difference, that the building looks much straighter and much truer to what it probably was originally intended to look like. Well, let's talk about the pediment sculpture. Well, as you can guess, not much of the pediment is there. And there's even less today than there was a few hundred years ago. So the pediment sculpture, some of the pediment sculpture was very fragmentary, but some of the pediment sculpture and some of the metopes and some of the frieze were still there right up until the early 19th century, and that is until Thomas Bruce, Lord Elgin, went there, and he went there with the intent to study the pediment sculptures and the statuary, but the Ottomans who were in charge of it at the time really had no interest in him studying it, but they said, hey, we'll sell it to you, and so they did. And so he and a bunch of workmen removed them from the Parthenon and shipped them back to London. So if you want to see the marbles of the Parthenon, you have to go to the British Museum in London. This was considered something of a scandal even at the time, a major piece of cultural theft. Now at the time, the Ottomans who controlled Greece were Muslim, and they didn't see this as their cultural heritage, so they didn't care. But the Greeks sure did. And when the Greeks eventually won independence, they wanted the marbles back. And there's still a major fight over who owns these marbles. What was funny is when England joined the EU and signed off on the EU Constitution, the EU Constitution had very strong cultural resource management laws. What a cultural resource management law is, it says that, if you find a historical and archaeological object, it belongs to the country that it was found in, and you cannot move it out of that country. So taking something like an antiquity out of modern Greece today is a major felony, and you could do some serious jail time for it. But England took those at a time when the EU didn't exist and didn't want to give them back. And it's kind of been contentious. Greece has built a massive new museum for the Acropolis, and they've actually included spaces for these marbles and have sued for the marbles to be returned. And England, basically under the, there's no other way to put it. They basically just said, neener, neener, finders, keepers, that's ours. Basically, and all of the other countries have done the same. They kind of said, hey, wait a minute, we stole your stuff good and, fair and square. You're not going to get it back. And now that England has gone out of the EU, I don't think it'll ever come back. If there was ever a case to be made for the repatriation of some lost sculpture, that should have been it. And this is a very big issue, especially because I teach non-Western art. And a lot of the great treasures of non-Western cultures were stolen. Were stolen by Europeans. If you want to go see the great bronzes and works from the Benin culture in West Africa, guess what? You got to go to the British Museum because they stole them, etc., etc. And this is really, a major issue. And if there was ever a case that you thought that maybe something would be returned, Greece was part of the EU. So, in Greece, it's not like Greece isn't going to take care of these. They'll definitely be taken care of. What reason does England have to hold on to it other than, it's just part of their national pride that, hey, we stole it good and fair and square and we're going to keep it. But some things have been returned, not from England. I was absolutely stunned, but Italy stole a massive obelisk from Oxum in Ethiopia, back when Italy was under the power of Mussolini and a big fascist state. They invaded Italy and they stole a bunch of artifacts, but they sent the obelisk back. They gave it back just a few years ago. So it is possible things can be returned, and I think generally, unless there's a danger of the object being destroyed, for example, Iraq, under control of ISIS, was destroying artifacts. So you wouldn't return an artifact under that situation. But in any other case where the country is stable and they have the means to take care of the artifacts, you should send the artifacts back. There's a very, very disgusting... Sorry, I'm going off on a rant. It's a moral rant, but I really think you need to hear this. It's a very disgusting practice that the West, because it's rich and because it's wealthy, feels like it can steal things and get away with it, and that's true even today. A very famous sculpture from Cambodia, from the Khmer Empire, was stolen. It was just cut right off of the temple and wound up on the market and at a major auctioneer. And a professor that I knew actually had a photograph of when he had seen the thing back in the 1980s and had a photograph of it to prove that it hadn't entered the market before that. But the auction house that was selling it saying, oh, this was part of a collection for 300 years. They were saying that, no, it was taken hundreds of years ago. No, it was taken literally, a decade ago. And because he had that photographic evidence, they were going to force them to return it. But the outcome of that was actually kind of tragic, because in the end, Cambodia didn't have the money to protect this work of art and put it in a museum and take care of it. So what happened is the museum that purchased it returned it to Cambodia, but the object never moved. Instead, what they did is they, after they'd paid the auction house, and the auction house got its money, they paid another fee to Cambodia, and now if you go and see it, it's there in a Western museum, and it says, on loan from the people of Cambodia. And so, in theory, it'll go back to Cambodia someday, but it probably never will. And so it's an example of powerful institutions in the West exercising their muscle, that even when they get caught red-handed stealing something and buying something that was taken and poached illegally on the market, they're still keeping it. It's really kind of tragic. The same thing happened to a set of frescoes that were taken from Cyprus that belonged to the Greek Orthodox Church in Cyprus, and they were taken because Cyprus has this war with Turkey, and the building was abandoned, and the people who took the frescoes had no right to take them, and they wound up on the market, and they were bought, and they wound up in the collection of the Melian Foundation in Houston. I think it's the Melian Foundation. Don't misquote. I may be quoting that wrong. And when they found out that they were in fact stolen, again they negotiated this deal. Well, okay, they belong to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of the Patriarchate of Cyprus, but they're on loan for 10 years to the museum in Houston. And so they were there in Houston, and they built a building for these beautiful frescoes. And then the most amazing thing happened. The 10-year lease came up, and I thought for sure what was going to happen is they were just going to get another 10-year lease. And Cyprus said, nope, they're ours, give them back. And so there is this, and they gave them back. Good for them. They finally gave them back. So there is... the tide is turning. People are getting sick of this. People are getting sick of this idea that just because you stole something, centuries ago, doesn't mean you still have rights to it. That there is a kind of cultural heritage too, and we have an obligation to protect the cultural heritage of other things. And so, heck, I guess you can't blame Western civilization. We do it to other cultures, but we do it to ourselves too, as this is the point. All right, well, let's talk about these. Sorry about the rant. Rant mode disengaged. Okay, so let's talk about the East Pediment. So not much of the East Pediment survives, but the story of the East Pediment seems to be the birth of Athena. The story of Athena is that a prophecy is made that if Zeus bears a male child by Metis, this Titan, that she will produce a child that will overthrow him. So he's terrified of this curse, so he decides he's going to get out of this curse by playing a trick on the Titan Metis, and they decide to play a game of, let's play a game of shape-shifting, and they each turn into a different animal, and eventually he tricks Metis into turning into a fly, and he swallows her. And so that way, Metis is taken care of. It's pretty brutal. But years later, Metis is still alive inside of him because she's still a goddess after all. And she was secretly pregnant with Zeus's child. And so she begins hammering away inside his mind. And Zeus gets this splitting headache. And so he calls for Hephaestus, the smith, the craftsman of the gods, and he cracks open Zeus's head, and Athena is born fully grown and fully armored from the head of Zeus. And so it's this kind of astonishing miracle. And so a lot of the interaction, you can see people, their hands are thrown up like, holy crap. And you see the other gods and goddesses in astonishment. Not very much survives. What we have is these figures right here. And what we seem to have is Iris. Iris is the goddess of rainbows, but also a messenger of the gods and a messenger of childbirth. And she seems to be coming to tell other gods, holy crap, did you see what was born out of Zeus's head? And so maybe this is Demeter and Persephone, and maybe this is Dionysus. And then over here we have the heads of horses, and this is the chariot of the sun rising from underneath the horizon. So when we look at these figures, one thing that really captures us is this dynamic quality. Notice how the drapery is used. The drapery doesn't conceal the figure, it reveals the figure. It follows the contour of the thighs. It's this clingy, almost like wet kind of drapery. And even on Iris, you can see how it billows up against her legs to show the movement of her legs. You can see how it billows to show her movement in this direction. Same with these characters. As we go to Dionysus, he's quite eroded and damaged, but we can see the superb drapery underneath him and the incredible anatomy. And the detail is really astonishing because even behind, they've even fully carved these things on behind. And even though these things are 60 feet up in the air and the backs never would have been seen, they had this level of attention to detail. On the other side are three goddesses. And those three goddesses seem to be sharing the news as well. And we're not exactly certain who these three goddesses are. It could be the three fates. There's lots of different possible. But the same thing. They are just absolutely awash in drapery. They got simple tunics, but they have 40 yards of fabric. But the artist uses that drapery to reveal the body. As I've mentioned before, we tend to think of Greeks liking nude statuaries. Well, that's true when it comes to men, but they really didn't show nude women. Nude women was considered immodest. But they did love the human form, and so they, in order to show the human form here, they have all of this drapery. And again, the drapery shows this incredible motion. And look how deeply carved it is to get the realism. You can see the heavier, they even can tell the difference between the heavier woolen cloths over their laps, these are their mantles, and the lighter kind of linen cloths which make up their chitons, their dresses. So the hymatians or mantles are over there. You can see the difference in the cloth. It's really incredible. And the cloth has all of this spirited movement to create, energy in these figures. And of course, these would have been painted, and they would have been very, very lively and dynamically painted. There's one other major sculptural program. All of the sculptural program of the Parthenon was created by Phidias and his workshop, and that is the Panathenaic Frieze. And so just inside the peristyle, around the outer wall of the naos, is this frieze. Here's another view looking up at it. It's this section here. And you can tell that unlike the Doric frieze, which is made up of triglyphs and metopes, this is a continuous frieze that goes all the way around all four sides of the building. It's more than 200 individual blocks, and it would have been right up near the top. Here's a rather romantic painting of it. When Lord Elgin brought a lot of these scenes back, the British painter Sir Lawrence Alma Tadima created this very kind of fanciful vision of Phidias showing off his work to his closest friends. So here they are in the scaffolding. You can see they have to go up on the scaffolding to get close to see it. And that's actually kind of interesting because it's remarkable that these things are so high in the air. They're not quite life-size. They're a little bit shorter. They're about 4 feet tall. But they would have been very hard to read from the ground. But it's also important to know that they would have been painted. So the Panathenaic Frieze is this long frieze. About half of the blocks are currently in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, and that's here, and another half are in England in the British Museum, and then there's a few blocks scattered across a few other collections. So what is the Panathenaic Frieze? Well, the Panathenaic Frieze details the Panathenaic procession. And what is the Panathenaic procession? Well, the Panathenaic procession was the largest religious procession in ancient Athens. It was a massive event. There were games, there were festivities, there were sacrifices, but the biggest part of it was there would be a ceremonial procession that would go all the way from the gates of the city, wind its way through the sacred districts of the city, and go all the way up to the Acropolis. And the purpose of this was to honor and to revere a very, very ancient statue on the Acropolis, which was a olive wood statue made of Athena. And now the olive wood statue, is probably very similar to the stories of the Palladium. The Palladium, according to legend, was a wooden statue that existed in Troy of Athena, and it was an old, ancient wooden statue and regarded as very, very sacred. Here's a story of Cassandra clinging to it as Ajax the Lesser tries to pull her away from it. Here's another depiction of her clinging to it. So this wooden statue that existed in Athens was like the Palladium. It's the legendary Palladium, and it was considered a protector of the city. And every year it had to be renewed, washed, cleaned, and it would be dressed in a new peplos. And a peplos was made out of virgin wool, and it was a single rectangular piece of cloth that was bound around the body and pinned at the shoulders, and then allowed to fold down and drape over the rest of the body. So the very end of this long procession shows the bearers of the peplos taking it so that it can be draped over this very sacred wooden statue. And that seems to have been the intent of it. But there's a lot of things going on. For one, it starts with a horse race. Horse races were very, very popular. Notice that there are no stirrups. There are no stirrups in the ancient world. And you can see, again, this would have been painted. The horse race was one of the most amazing horse races. You actually had to grab onto the horse while the horse was at full gallop. The horse would run down the length of a stadium, and you'd have to grab it Legolas style and pull yourself up on it and keep going. So there were all kinds of entertainments and festivities. There was also sacrifice. So here we see young men who are wearing these hymations, these heavy cloaks. These are men who are clearly acting as priests or initiates who are bringing bulls to be slaughtered to Athena. We have in this really beautiful section of the relief, this one's in the Louvre, these are the Ergostines. The Ergostines are women who are the weavers or the attendants who would have made the peplos and accompanied the peplos. So we have these, and the women are wearing appropriately peploses. Or I have no idea what the plural of peplos is in Greek. Darn it. But you can see that it's the dresses are folded down over the top and pinned at the shoulders. And here they are coming up against priests, and they are presenting themselves to the priests as part of this long assembly. Look at how beautiful the drapery is. You almost have to see in the detail how this is a detail of this section here, and you can see the hands and the intricate nature of it. So these are young women that were chosen, probably an enormous honor. And all of this ends with the procession coming to the gods themselves. The actual identity of the gods here is not entirely certain because, unfortunately, the heads are kind of missing. You can see that the heads stick out a bit. That's what they get busted. But you can see that the procession is coming up to the gods. You'll notice that the women who are bearing the sacred artifacts are, in fact, quite small, and the gods are shown as larger, but the gods themselves are enthroned. But again, look at all this beautiful drapery. Here's this group here. Also, look at how casual the gods are. They're kicking back. This one's got his leg up. This is somebody who has really examined how humans sit, how they interact. Here we get to the scene that we saw before, where the peplos is presented to a young girl, or a young boy, I think in this case, and the young maidens here are bearing them, and this now will be draped over the statue. But immediately next to them we have two figures that are usually interpreted as Zeus and Hera, the king and the queen of the gods. Zeus sits here enthroned, and Hera pulls her mantle over the top of her head, and we can see how her dress falls gently over her anatomy, revealing it with all the intricate detail. Really wonderful. Again, it gives real character, especially that, I love this scene where this guy pulls up a knee, like, he's kicking back, this person's leaning forward, this person's got a elbow up on the other person, say, hey, did you hear the story about... It's what I talked about, this idea of imagining them as real characters. Not only is the anatomy right, not only is the observation of detail right, but they imagine these as real characters and real people that have real lives. That's really what makes Greek art so different. There's nothing like this kind of touch of humanity in anything else in the Near Eastern world. And the Eastern world has some amazing stuff, some beautiful stuff, but not like this. Greece and the ideas of Greece are truly unique. Well, let's go to the Erechtheion. That's the Parthenon. Let's go to the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion is an odd duck of a building. And as you can see, it doesn't look like any building anywhere else in Greece. And the reason for that is it had to accommodate a number of different cults and functions. It commemorates the house of Erechtheus, who was the founding king of Athens, but it also had to have a courtyard, and in the courtyard are commemorated a spring and the first olive tree. According to ancient legend, according to myths, Greece had two patron deities, Poseidon and Athena, who are, and even in ancient times, were the two chief deities in Athens. And so the question became, who is going to be the patron deity of the city? You can't have more than one. And so they have a contest. And Poseidon, who strikes the ground with his trident and causes a stream, a spring, to suddenly appear. But the spring is salty. And there was a salty spring up on the Acropolis, a kind of sulfur, kind of saltwater soda springs. You've ever been to Colorado Springs, Manitou Springs? They have natural sulfurish kind of salty springs there. And so there was a spring that was like that. And so since he's god of the sea, that's why it had this kind of salty soda flavor. But Athena strikes the ground and upsprouts an olive tree. And an olive tree, of course, produces olives, and olives produce olive oil. And you're like, okay, so they were really into Mediterranean cooking. No. The reason the olive oil is important is because olive oil was the chief fuel for lighting. Oil lamps were how you lit homes, and olive oil was the preferred oil to do that with. So the olive tree is a symbol of light and a symbol of knowledge. Well, because of that, Athena gives the better gift, and so she is chosen as the patron deity. And so that's part of what this courtyard exists for. So there's two major parts of the Erechtheion we're going to look at. We're going to look at the porch of the Caryatids and the Ionic porch. Let's take a look at the Ionic porch first. So the Ionic porch is probably one of the best early examples of the Ionic order. And right away, you can tell this is quite different than the Doric. No triglyphs, no metopes. Those are gone. Instead, you have a single continuous frieze. And also, you'll notice the columns have bases. And then the big thing that gives this away is the columns have volutes. They have little spiral volutes. So the Ionic order started in Ionia, and it really is regarded as the more feminine of the orders. If Doric is masculine, strong, virile, then the Ionic order is going to be about feminine virtues, which includes elegance, civilization, erudition, sophistication. And so you'll notice that the proportions of the Ionic are much taller. It's much taller and much thinner and much more elegant. And the volutes really do give it a lot more flair. So when you compare the orders side by side, you'll notice that the architrave and the entablature is going to be a lot thinner. Ionic buildings are going to be taller. The columns are going to be thinner. And then you're going to have bases that are, you have really kind of strong points that delineate the sections. You have these volutes to get these dramatic flare between there and the entablature. And these, you have this toroid form on the base that gives it this real flare. So it's regarded as much more elegant, much more sophisticated. There are times where the Doric is more appropriate because it indicates strength and simplicity, but sometimes you want the Ionic. And the Ionic is truly one of the exceptional orders. Very, very beautiful, very lovely. As far as the origin of the Ionic, it actually comes from the Near East. Again, it's one of these things that demonstrates that the Greeks borrow a lot of their ideas from the Near East, but then they improve them and make them uniquely Greek. So if you remember those palm trees and those designs in the ancient Near East that had these volutes, that's what this is. This is a very stylized palm tree. This is what we call an Aeolic capital, and these were all over the ancient Near East. And so the Ionic is the Greek update on that. So if the Doric is the Greek update on those faceted, simplified Egyptian columns, this is the Greek update on the Aeolic columns, which were found throughout the Near East and found on temples and places throughout the Near East. Now, I do want to point out that architecture does have meaning, and people took this seriously, that there were times where they thought that the Ionic order was more appropriate than the Doric. So things like funerary monuments or temples to major deities were often Doric, but details and tombs and other things that were dedicated to women were often Ionic. Libraries were more often than not Ionic than Doric. It's interesting because that indicates erudition, intelligence, etc. Generally Ionic is feminine, but not always. And generally, Doric is masculine, but again, not always. And I point this out because we're still living with this tradition today. I used to teach at a small college in far west Texas, Sul Ross State, great place. But one of my favorite things about it is that an absolutely beautiful campus that was done in a neo-classical style. And one of the buildings, when I would teach this same lecture on campus there, I would take them to the buildings, and I would teach classical architecture from the buildings. And this is Lawrence Hall. And you'll notice that Lawrence Hall has an Ionic porch right there. The volutes, you can tell. And when this was built to be the women's dormitory. When women were first allowed to come to Sul Ross State, they built them a dormitory, and the architect, because he knew his history and his art history, gave it an Ionic porch because he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that as well. And it always remarked to me, and funny thing is, nobody knew that. Now it's an administration building. But at the time, nobody, when I was there, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. People's like, why? The architects really knew what they were doing. The art and science buildings had this very rare capital type that was a combination between lotus blossoms and acanthus leaves. And it's actually a type that's associated with Apollo. And that's important because Apollo is the god of arts and sciences. And I said, oh my gosh! And people had no idea. People had no idea. I can't do this at UVU. UVU is all mid-century modern. So when I do mid-century modern and I teach that, I take people out on campus at UVU. But I miss having a classical campus to go teach classical art and architecture on. Oh well, moving on. So the other great part of the Erechtheion is the caryatid porch. So we've talked about caryatids before at the Siphthian treasury. A caryatid is, of course, a female figure that acts as a column. And so we have this elaborate porch that has these female figures. I love how the figures are alternating, that the ones on one side have the right leg forward, and the ones on the other side have the left leg forward. So there's a symmetry. And these things are really a kind of a marvel. For one, you've got to support the weight of a heavy stone porch, and you've got to do that on a human figure. And in order to do that, you've got to conceal a lot of mass in these objects. So what they did is they still wanted the contrapposto They still want the contrapposto. So they have the 1D out, But then they realized if we depict this as if the drapery is falling down straight, that will conceal the other leg, but it'll still look believable. But it'll look like, it's really amazing because it echoes the fluting of a column, and yet it still looks like drapery, and it hides the mass. It's really ingenious. And of course, the way that the drapery folds over the hips, revealing the figure and the breasts. I love that when we look at these. Now, the original caryatids were removed and put in a museum because they were too fragile. So these are replicas, but these are the originals in the museum. And when you look at them, you can really see how the drapery falls and mimics the fluting of the column, but also conceals the mass. They also did something similar with the ponytails. She's got a really thick ponytail. Well, the reason she's got a thick ponytail is because if they just left it to her neck, that wouldn't be enough mass of stone to support the ceiling. So they concealed that with the hair. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Perfect mix of engineering and this wonderful new naturalism and classicism. It shows that they're both committed. They're committed to both creating functional objects, but also objects that have this inherent beauty to them. So finally, let's talk about the Temple of Athena Nike. So the Temple of Athena Nike is there right out on the front end of the Propylaea, and it is dedicated to Athena, the goddess of victory. So one thing you have to realize about the Greek world is that gods get overlapped all the time. Aphaea is this god of healing, but they combine Aphaea with Athena and they become one god. It's kind of interesting. So same thing here. Nike is a god of victory. Athena is the patron of the city. So they have combined them together in a kind of dualistic aspect. So it's up there on this large promontory, this kind of artificial promontory. You'll notice that it is Ionic in order. You can see the beautiful Ionic columns. So it has a continuous frieze. It has recently been restored, and I have never seen it with even a partial pediment intact. So these are photos that I dug up just recently, and you can see again, anything that's bright white marble is brand new marble. I've never seen it this good. I've never seen it look this good. It's always been kind of half taken apart. So they recently just took it apart block by block and have totally reassembled it. They're in the process of rebuilding the balustrade. We'll talk about the balustrade in a minute. But as you can see, it's a beautiful little temple. It's a teeny tiny temple. And it's got an Ionic order. But you'll notice that it doesn't have a peristyle all the way around. It's such a tiny temple, it doesn't have room for a full peristyle. But what's funny is that they still insist on an apostolimus. So you enter from the east end. So this is the east end here. But there's nothing to do in the other porch. In fact, this porch on the back side is so small you can barely kind of fit in there. It's just a sham porch. It exists there because we have to have a porch on the other side. Because we have a pronaos on one side, we've got to have an apostolimus on the other. So it shows how they absolutely have this mania, almost this OCD nature where if you have a porch on one side, you have to have it on the other, just because it's symmetrical, because that's the way Greek buildings are, even if you can't shoehorn an entire peristyle in there. One of the other features that they're busy reconstructing now is the balustrade. So the balustrade was this, handrail. The balustrade prevented people from falling off the edge. And it was decorated, with a collection of Nike figures. These are figures of a winged victory. Victory has wings because it comes and it brings victory to you. It has to come quickly. It can also leave quickly, which is kind of part of the metaphor. And the balustrade is just some of the most beautiful decoration. And this is done a little bit later than some of the other sculpture on the site. And you can see Nike is here. Her head is unfortunately missing. Her head would have been there. She also would have had a wing. So her wing is now broken off. But she is either loosening her sandal down here or binding her sandal. We're not entirely certain, one or the other. The implication is that she's tying her shoes together because she's got to go declare victory. She's got to get moving. Or she's just come back from declaring victory, so she's kicking off her shoes after a long day. One of the others. Either way, again, what a wonderful human moment Again, they take their gods, and instead of just showing their gods as icons, they show them as if they're real people with, kind of real gestures. And then the drapery is just astonishing. Again, it has this wet drapery feel. She looks like she's wearing 40 yards of fabric on this thing. But you can see how the artist has carefully used the drapery to go over, to define the shape of the body underneath, and then how deeply they've cut it to the grooves so it clings to the body. And it's funny, she's got more than enough cloth to conceal her, but she is completely unconcealed. The body has been revealed. So this was a way of maintaining her modesty, but also highlighting the skill of the artist and highlighting the human form. Now, as we go on later, eventually they will get to a full nude female, but not yet. Again, we always think that Greeks love nude statues. That's true about guys. The athletic ideal is a nude dude. But not true of females. It actually takes a lot for them to come around to depict the nude form of a female. So instead, they'll work with the drapery to reveal this high level of naturalism. But again, I love the humanizing details. She's doing something that any one of us could do. Well, we're not flying, obviously, but she, reaching down to unlace your shoe, untie your sandal, or tie it up while you're getting ready to go outside. They imagine them as real people. They observed people acting and moving in real ways and evoked that in their art. Really incredible stuff. Well, that's the highlights of the Acropolis. We'll stop there for now. We'll come back. This lecture has a second part. This lecture will have a second part. We'll talk about some of the great pieces of classical sculpture outside of the Acropolis and Parthenon, and then we'll talk about what happens after this high moment when we move into the age of Philip II of Macedon and into the Hellenistic age and beyond. Thanks so much. We'll catch you next time.